Just 12 months after writing my first line of code, I was working as a software engineer at Microsoft, and I didn't even have a college degree. And in this video, I'm going to distill 4 years of coding, learning, and industry experience into a strategy that you can use and implement to fast track yourself into the software engineering industry with predictability. So when it comes to being able to do it as fast as possible, the fastest possible way might be having someone that you know that already works in the industry as a coder and asking them for a referral. And then in the interview, you just sell yourself as someone who's hardworking and smart and can learn on the job. And sure, that's possible. Maybe you could do that in like 2 weeks. So maybe that's like the fastest way, but that's not very predictable. That's not likely. That's improbable. Now, on the flip side, if we try and maximize the probability that you get into the industry, you can build a ton of software product, build your personal brand as someone who is a competent software engineer, build an online audience, and you'll be known around, social media or whatever as someone who can build software. And this is a high probable way that you'll be able to get interviews and get into the industry. But that takes a lot of time. So in this video, I'm going to come up with a strategy with you that we can use to implement. And this will be a combination of being able to do it fast while also being a relatively probable that you get into the industry. So it's a sweet spot, because a more common example is someone might want to just focus on front end. And sure, that's the fastest way to kind of learn a domain. And you could get into the industry just learning front end, but it is more unlikely that someone's going to hire you just as a front end developer if you don't have any experience or a degree. And so in this video, I'm more going to focus on what is the fastest way yet probable way that you can fast track yourself into the coding industry. So let's get into the video. So I'm going to break the video into 5 sections. First section is talk about what we're optimizing for specifically. So when I say get into coding, that's kind of vague. So we need to kind of define what we mean by getting into a coding job. Okay. And then second is we're going to talk about the 3 bottlenecks that are stopping you from actually landing the job. And that's basically getting interviews, passing interviews, and being able to do coding work. And then third thing we're going to focus on is software dev in a nutshell, just kind of a crash course of what software development is. So you can have a bird's eye view of how it all works. So you have like perspective and you know what to focus on, you know what you're doing a little bit. And then we'll get into my recommended path. So knowing all that, what is like the learning path and the path that I recommend you execute certain things to be able to get into the industry fast and predictably. And then last thing is what to look for in a program. So if you are going to join like some kind of program, like a bootcamp or a coaching program, what I would recommend looking for in one of those programs if you decide to fast track yourself into the industry instead of trying to do it on your own. So we'll get into that at the end of the video. Before we get into the strategy, let's be clear on the outcome that we're optimizing for, so that way you know if this is something that's relevant to you or not. So the goal we're optimizing for is landing a job where coding is the primary function. So coding is the main skill set of your job, and software is code. So coding is developing software. So we're optimizing for a job in software development. And most software development jobs involve creating software products that companies can generate revenue from, which is why you're a valuable asset to a company as a software developer, because you are creating the stuff that they make money from. So that's why we're optimizing for a software developer who creates software products. So we want to work at a company that creates software products, but there's also a difference between getting into a big tech company versus like a smaller company. And so when it comes to big tech, you need to go much harder on algorithms and data structures. And perhaps I can get into that into another video, but I'm not going to talk about that in this video because that's not the fastest way to get into the industry. It's what I did, but most of my time during those 12 months that I was studying was spent on algorithms and data structures. And that was a big time sink. And if you want to get into big tech, you're going to have to spend most of your time focusing on algorithms and data structures, and the interview process isn't really gonna even test your full stack development knowledge as much. They're likely just gonna test your algorithm. So at Microsoft, all I did was algorithm questions in Python, a programming language, and some system design questions. But then on the interview, I did React and JavaScript. So the interview process wasn't even relevant to what I did on the job, but you had to do that if you want to get into big tech. But in this video, I'm focusing on the fastest way to become a software developer in general, not big tech. And so when it comes to landing a software development job, there are 3 bottlenecks you need to solve to get into the industry. So ultimately, if we simplify it, it really comes down to being able to get software development interviews, being able to pass those software development interviews, and then be able to do software development work once you're hired. As long as you can do those 3 things, then you get into the industry and you're starting a career as a software developer. So in order to solve these 3 bottlenecks, I'll start with doing software development work. So a common misconception for complete beginners is that they can just learn a programming language and know basic programming, and then they can land a job programming. But that's not really how it works. You need to specialize in a domain so that way you can solve specific problems for a company. Programming in a single programming language is just your foundations, but it's not enough to get a job. So if programming alone is not enough, then what do we need to do to become a software developer? Well, we want to be able to have the skills necessary to build an entire software product from front to back. So being able to build an entire software product, that's how you're going to maximize your ability to be able to produce value at whatever company you're hired, because you kind of know the whole stack and you're able to build entire software products on your own. And so that would be my recommendation. So if you can build an entire software product from front to back, you have a good skill set, but getting interviews is a challenge too. And to get interviews, we should understand a few things first, which is that there are a lot of people that want to get into the software development industry because people are learning that it pays a lot of money, 6 figures, and you don't need a degree. So it seems pretty lucrative and like a good deal. But because of that, there's a lot of applicants applying for entry-level software developer roles. There's a lot of supply of people trying to become software developers for the first time, but at the same time, there's not a lot of job openings for software development work for entry-level developers. And that's because software development is a complex profession that requires a great amount of skill. And so people who are entry level, they don't have the skills to actually produce a lot of value for a company. It's only when they have a few years of experience and they have a track record of actually building software that a company feels more confident that they can come in and actually help build their product. So what companies actually look for are software developers who have a proven track record of building software and doing software development work, which gives the company confidence that if they hire that person, they can do the job. So there's a high supply of entry-level software developers, but a low demand for entry-level software developers. But on the flip side, there's a high demand for experienced software developers because experienced software developers have a track record of building software, and companies want those developers who have that track record because they feel confident that these experienced software developers can build their product. But at the same time, the supply for these more experienced software developers isn't nearly as high because, first of all, software development is a high barrier to entry industry. It's a hard skill to learn. And second of all, these people are already working at companies. They're not looking for a new job. So with that in mind, when it comes to getting software developer interviews, the best thing you can do is to position yourself as someone who is as experienced as possible. So building personal projects is better than nothing. That's a way to try and show track record and proof that you can build software. But what's even better is if you can look like someone who's already working in the industry, and that'll make it way easier for you to actually get interviews. So you want to look as senior as possible. If you're just going to learn like a little bit of coding and have a few like simple projects on your resume, you're very unlikely to get an interview because there's a large supply of these people trying to get their foot in the door, but not a lot of demand. So you got to differentiate yourself from all the bootcamp grads and the college graduates and position yourself as someone more experienced. So that's how you're going to solve that bottleneck of being able to get interviews. So for my own personal journey, I spent like 4 months learning front-end web development and focusing really hard on algorithms, data structures, and preparing for the interviews. And I applied for 4 months and I didn't get any interviews. So I didn't even have a chance to demonstrate the skills that I worked so hard for. So don't do that. That was a waste of time. So what I should have done was, if I could go back, would be to make myself look as experienced and as competent as possible on my resume first before I started applying for jobs. Because I thought that if I had the skills, then I could get the job and then someone would just interview me. But they don't give out interviews that easy. You got to look the part on the resume before you get invited for an interview. Now, when it comes to passing interviews, it's basically a test. And so you need to know what the questions are on the test, and you need to be able to prepare for those questions specifically. So if you actually know full stack development really well and you know the technologies that you're working with, then that's probably like 60% of preparing for the interview. But then the interview itself might have other things involved, like solving an algorithm or a bunch of software development trivia questions, but then also questions about your resume and your experience. And so you need to be prepared to answer the questions about your experience and be able to talk about your experience in depth in a way that sells yourself as a competent, skilled software engineer. And then there's other things you should focus on rather than just working on a big project, because a lot of times interviews are only like, 45 minutes, maybe shorter, maybe a little longer. But the interviews it's a time constraint. So you want to be able to build things quickly. So building small, well-defined apps in a short amount of time is going to be another way that you can prepare for these interviews. But yeah, as long as you know what the questions are and like what's going to come up in the interview, then you know what to focus on. So you just need to focus on those things. So in a nutshell, high level, that's how you would solve those 3 bottlenecks: being able to do software development work, be full stack, be able to get software engineering interviews, look as senior as possible, and then being able to pass the software development interviews. You need to be able to prepare exactly what's on the interview, which maybe it's obvious, but just wanted to outline those 3 bottlenecks so it's kind of clear what's important, what actually moves the needle towards you actually landing the job. And then when it comes to full stack development, you might think that just learning front-end development, for example, is faster, and it is faster. And if you can't get a job as a front-end developer, then cool, that's faster, but that is improbable compared to learning full stack development. So another problem I had is when I dialed in my resume and I made it look more experienced, I started applying for interviews, but I only had knowledge in front end. And a lot of the interviews, even if they were hiring front end developers, they still asked some back end questions and some system design questions, to my surprise. And I didn't pass the interviews because of that. So again, I would recommend learning full stack development because there's more work in that area. So I also wasted a lot of time trying to apply as a front end developer when I should have just went full stack from the beginning. So yeah, full stack takes a little longer, but again, we're trying to find the sweet spot between the fastest way while also being highly probable that you actually land the job. And so that's my recommendation for the sweet spot. You want to learn full stack development. Okay, so now that those 3 bottlenecks have been defined and I gave you the high level view of how you would solve each bottleneck, let's get into what full stack development actually is at a high level. So that way, when I talk about the learning path that you're going to take, you can kind of put it into context in what part of the stack it's relevant to. So first, what you should understand is the basics of a software product. At the most fundamental level, it's generally just going to start with the database that holds the data, and then that data will go to a backend server, which is going to handle logic, business logic, and then this backend server is going to send that data that it got from the database into the front-end app, which is where the front-end app basically presents the data to the user using the app. It's the presentation layer. And so essentially what happens is the data goes through the logic layer and then it goes into the front-end app, and the front-end app will ask the back-end server for the data that it wants. And so then the back-end server will do whatever logic it needs to do, and then it'll get that data from the database and then send it to the presentation layer, which is the front end. And I'm simplifying it just so we know like what's core. Obviously there's more stuff that's going on, but essentially that's how it works. But you know, the app does more than just like sending data from the back end to the user. Actually, the types of operations that we do on the data, it can be broken down to an acronym called CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. So the app can read the data, it can create data, so it can send data to the backend server and then it'll create that data in the database. It can update data, so there's existing data and we update it somehow, or we can delete data somehow. So in an app, this is really like the basics, right? And then the data to the back end to the front end, and then we can do CRUD operations on the database. So let me give you a very simple example. Let's say we have a to-do app. The to-do app is where you can add a to-do item, you can update the to-do item, and you can delete the to-do item. And you can also read the to-do item, meaning you can just see the list of to-do items that are available. So those are the CRUD operations: creating a to-do item, deleting a to-do item, updating a to-do item. That's, you know, what it comes down to fundamentally. Now, obviously, if you want to create something more complex than just a to-do app, there's more stuff that goes on, but it happens in between these CRUD operations. There's just more complexities generally being added to these CRUD operations. So for example, let's say the user doesn't have permission to view certain data. The backend server might do logic involved in determining whether the front end who's requesting the data has permission to access that data or not. And then if somehow the front end is trying to ask the backend to delete some data that it doesn't have permission to delete, the backend won't let the front end delete that data store. And there's plenty of other business logic we can add to the backend server. So for example, I've built a learning management system where my students will learn how to code, and there are lessons that they complete, and when they complete the lesson, there is review items added to a review system that determines when they should review that information from the completed lesson to ensure that they memorize everything from that lesson. And so that's more logic that's happening in the app. But at the most basic level, when a user completes a lesson, they are updating data in the database. And then when they go to the review manager, they are just reading data, which is the review items for the lessons that they've completed. And then there's logic to determine when the user's reading the review items, if that review item is due today or not. So there's, more stuff that's added to the backend layer, of course, but that just kind of sits in between the basic CRUD operations. These are just things we add on top of it to add more functionality. So now that we have this data store, the business logic, and the presentation layer, that's a full stack product. And then we just need to host that in the cloud so people can actually use that product via the internet. And so once you can do all those things, that's going to be the basic idea behind full stack development and be able to create a product from front to back. These are the main things that you'd want to learn. So building applications more complex than just a regular to-do app is going to require more problem-solving skills and also learning technologies that solve the problem for you. But I don't recommend learning all the technologies necessary to build any kind of app. That would mostly be a waste of time. What's more important is gaining experience that will position you as an experienced, competent software developer on your resume. And so that might mean building certain applications with certain functionalities. And then you're just going to learn whatever technology is necessary to build that specific application. So you're going to learn technologies as you build something rather than just learning technologies for the sake of learning technologies. You're going to learn them to actually build something cool. That's the best way to do it, in my opinion. Because what's most important is just demonstrating yourself as a software developer with a strong track record of building complex applications and making yourself look like someone that can come in and actually do the work and solve any kind of software problem that they have. That's going to be much more valuable than learning all the technologies that they're already used in software development. With that said, though, there are some technologies that might be useful for you to learn, such as authentication. So being able to log users in and out and creating accounts and permission stuff, and then also continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. This automates software testing and deployment, enhancing the speed and reliability of the software app, and then being able to know how to write tests for the app to make it more reliable. These are just more internal processes to help with the software development process. And I'm not saying you should learn that specifically. I'm just giving you some examples. There are other things that are high value to learn, but they're not exactly super necessary. And then there's other stuff like writing good software. You want to keep your code modular. You want to keep it clean. There's practices to help do that, such as Solid, but these are more coding principles and concepts to write good code, but it's not really as relevant to the actual product that people will see and use. It's more for the developers to ensure that they can consistently improve the product over time without introducing new bugs and be able to add new features more fast. And this is done by keeping the code clean and organized. But in a nutshell, that's full stack development. So now that you have some context, let's go into the learning path. So first thing you want to do is you want to learn a programming language, and you need to get good at fundamental programming. That's going to be your core skill set as a software developer, being able to problem solve programmatically. And so the language that I recommend you learn is JavaScript. The reason I recommend JavaScript is because you can use JavaScript on the front end and the back end. So it's actually the only language you can use on the front end, and then on the back end, there's a lot of different options. But to keep things simple, I would recommend using the same language across the full stack, since you're going to become a full stack developer. And so when it comes to learning JavaScript, there's two main phases. The first phase is you need to learn the syntax of the language and the basic programming concepts. And then after you have the syntax and basic programming concepts down, then you should start solving coding challenges in JavaScript to develop your problem-solving skills. And my recommendation is you should be comfortable solving 6 KYU coding challenges on a website called codewars.com. The coding challenge, it goes from 1 KYU to 8 KYU. 8 KYU is actually the easiest, 1 KYU is the hardest. And so I recommend you be able to solve around 6 KYU. That'll give you a good foundation. At this point, if you can solve 6 KYU problems, then you have a solid grasp of basic programming. And then I say we can move on to the next part of the recommended path, which is actually starting to learn full stack development at this point. So once you learn JavaScript, you want to get into building the front end app. I recommend you start there because you can tangibly see what you're building more easily, whereas the back end can be a bit more abstract, but I think front end is an easier starting point. So for the front end, you're going to want to learn HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and React.js. This is how you're going to be able to build robust, dynamic front-end applications. And so once you have that down, you'll be able to build front-end applications. So at this point, I'd say you should be able to build a to-do app in React, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. React is just a JavaScript library. But once you can build a to-do app with React, that's good enough to go to the next portion of this recommended path, because at this point you've built a front-end app that does CRUD operations. So that's the first step. And so with the front-end to-do app, you're going to be managing the data on the front end. And so the data won't be in a database. You'll be able to manage that data in React using state. And that's something that you can learn on your own, but just kind of want to make that clear. The data will be hosted on the front-end app. And so then after you know the front end, now let's start working on the back end. So originally JavaScript was only able to run on the front end or on a browser, but it wasn't able to be used on the back end. So you should learn Node.js, which you don't have to learn too much about it, but basically Node.js allows you to run JavaScript on the back end. And then there's a framework you can learn called Express.js, which is a framework that allows you to receive requests from the front end and give responses. So basically Express.js is gonna allow the front end to communicate with the back end to get the data that it needs. And then I also recommend you learn MongoDB. That's a database, and that's where you're gonna actually store your data when you build a full stack to-do app. And then you can also use another Node.js library called Mongoose, which is gonna allow you to do CRUD operations on the MongoDB database from the Node.js backend. So the Express.js is to interact with the front end, and the Mongoose is to interact with the database, and this is all from the backend server. And so at this point, now that you know the front end and the backend and the database and how to have the backend interact with the database and how to have the backend interact with the front end, you should be able to build a to-do app using React on the front end with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then build the backend app with Node.js, Express.js, Mongoose, and then the MongoDB database. And then instead of storing the to-do app data on the front end, you're gonna store it in the MongoDB database. Once you have this down, now you have the basics of being able to build a full stack application with CRUD operations. This is your foundation, and this is an awesome starting point for you. And so now you know the basics of full stack development. But then this full stack app is just living on your computer when you're developing it. So to have other people access it via the internet, you need to be able to push this code, which is the full stack app, into the cloud, which is just another computer that a company rents out to people. And then you have some kind of domain like, google.com, for example, route people to that server. So that way, when people use their browser to go to your website, say it's like google.com, the website will then send to your browser the front end code. So that way your browser will run the front end code so other people can actually see the app. From there, the front end app will send requests to the backend server, which is hosted on another server that the company is renting out, but that won't run on the user's computer, just the front end code. But so yeah, the next thing would be being able to deploy the app to the cloud so people can access it via the internet. And so there's a lot of cloud options. One modern one that's super simple that I would recommend if you just want to get something done quick is railway.app. It does a lot of the work under the hood for you, so you can easily deploy apps into the cloud. If you want to get a little more hands-on and do something a little more challenging, you can learn AWS, Amazon Web Services. And that's going to look better on your resume, although it's going to take more work, so it's going to take more time, but it's also going to make it more probable that you get hired. So it just depends if you want to kind of lean more towards getting set up so that way you have the highest probability of getting hired, or if you're just trying to get into the industry as fast as possible. It will make your resume look a little better if you have Amazon Web Services on your resume. But a lot of times just knowing the front end, the back end of the data without too much cloud experience is enough to get a job. But that's an option too that I just wanted to mention. So at this point, you can build a software product from front to back and have it hosted on the internet so other people can access it. And this is essentially like most fundamental parts of building a software application. People need to be able to use the product and interact with the data somehow and be able to access it via the internet. Like, that's the basics. So from here, if you want to build more complex applications, you'll need to learn other technologies and concepts. But instead of learning these technologies and concepts from the get-go for the sake of learning them, what I recommend you do is you instead start working on projects that you can put on your resume that will make you look more experienced. And when you work on these other projects, you're going to solve specific problems. You're going to have to build an app that's more complex. and you're just going to learn whatever is needed on the go as you learn how to do something specific.
On how to get into programming?
You are never going to learn programming by watching a video called Learn Programming. The only way to learn programming, I think, and the only way everyone I've ever met who can program well learned it all in the same way. They had something they wanted to do, and then they tried to do it. And then they were like, oh, well, okay, this is kind of, it'd be nice if the computer could kind of do this thing. And then, that's how you learn. You just keep pushing on a project. So the only advice I have for learning programming is go program.
So for example, if you're going to build a social media app, you're going to have to learn authentication. How can people create accounts, log in, log out, and keep people's data safe? And then a social media app has a lot of moving parts, so things can get disorganized more easily. And so that's when you can start seeing the value of clean code, keeping things modular, writing tests for your application to make sure things don't break and you don't introduce bugs as you're adding new features, as well as a continuous deployment pipeline. So that way, whenever you add new code to it, it's automatically pushed into the cloud so it's live for other people to see. These are things you can learn as you're building something more complex. And so when it comes to picking a project, there's several options that you have. And remember, the goal is to have projects that we can put on your resume to make you look as senior as possible and someone with a track record of building good software, so that way companies feel confident that if they hire you, there's a high likelihood that you're going to pass the interview and start actually producing value for them at the company. And so if we can make you look like a software engineer who's already working in the industry, that's going to make you look like that as much as possible. So you can do free work for a nonprofit company. You can start your own startup where the startup is a software product and you don't have to make any sales or any money from it. But the idea is that you're going to make a real product that solves a real problem, and then you can put that experience, a software development experience, on your resume. You can also contribute to open source projects. And then for my coaching program, I have a program that fast tracks people into the software development industry. I have a software company that students can work for so they can have experience to put on their resume. And so if that sounds interesting to you and you want to get fast tracked into the software development industry, you can book a call with me by clicking the link in the description. But whether you join my program or not, the idea is that you want to create projects that look good on your resume, make you look professional so you can get interviews. And then as you're building these more complex applications, you're learning whatever technologies or concepts necessary to do that work. So once you have experience building a software product, we can put that on your resume to make it look like you're a software engineer who's already in the industry. And basically, if you look at a software engineering resume and it's of one who's already been working as a software engineer at a company, you want to make yours look like that. You don't want to put like, oh, I did this project, I did this project. You want to make it look like software engineer working for this company, and then you list the work that you did for that company. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to make you look like a professional software developer who's already in the industry and who has a track record of building software products and actually doing software development work. So at this point, you can actually build software products and you have your resume set up so you can get interviews and you can do software development work. But now you need to be able to pass these software development interviews that you're going to get. So now let's focus on how to actually pass these software development interviews. So when it comes to preparing for the interviews, a common practice is to have the interview solve algorithms. An algorithm is basically just code that takes in a certain input and transforms that input into some kind of output. It's just going to test your logical problem-solving abilities. And it's much more emphasized at a big tech company. So if you're gonna go to big tech, that's by far one of the most important things you need to get down. But when it comes to getting your foot in the door at any company as fast as possible, it's not as important, but you still wanna get it down. And what I would recommend is learning the basics of data structures and algorithms. This is stuff like linked list, graphs, trees, being able to do a breadth first search and a depth first search on graphs and trees, and being able to reverse the linked list, do a binary search, be able to work with hash maps, know how to implement recursion, use stacks and queues, and also able to analyze the time and space complexity of an algorithm, which just determines how efficient the algorithm is. Now, this might be overkill for a lot of companies. They might not even ask you questions that require specific algorithm and data structure knowledge. But the thing about non-big tech companies is their interview process is much more unpredictable. So in order to maximize the probability that you're going to pass those interviews, you need to have a broad base of knowledge to maximize the probability you pass the interview. But in big tech, it's a bit of the opposite. You need a very deep knowledge in just algorithms. Just getting your foot in the door at any company, you just want to know the basic algorithms and data structures, and I would recommend being able to solve LeetCode easy problems on leetcode.com. If you can solve LeetCode easy problems, then that is mostly good enough. If you're going to go for big tech, that would be LeetCode mediums, but that's definitely overkill for most companies that are not big tech. And then when it comes to the web technologies that you've learned for the front end and the back end, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, React, Node.js, Express.js, Mongoose, MongoDB, you want to know how they work generally. You want to have a lot of the trivia questions about those specific technologies memorized. So that way they might ask you trivia questions in the interview and you want to be able to answer them concisely. And then you should have familiarity with the software development lifecycle. So when it comes to software products where a team is working on it, there's a life cycle, meaning like you start adding code to it, and then you test the code, and then you deploy the code, and then it's in production, and then other users can use it. And so, for example, when you're adding code to the software product, you're gonna have to use Git and version control to be able to collaborate with other developers. When you're adding the code, you want to make sure that you add tests to make sure that the code base stays maintainable, nothing breaks. And then you should have some familiarity with continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines. Continuous integration is when tests are automatically run before code contributions that a developer makes is merged to the main code base that all the developers are working on. And then continuous deployment is when those tests pass, those code changes are automatically deployed into the cloud. So that way in production, when people are accessing that app on the internet, those changes are live. And I want to be clear here, you do have to go broad to maximize the probability you pass these interviews, but you don't need to like have deep expertise in these things I'm mentioning, like web technologies and the software development lifecycle. You just want to have an idea of it and be able to talk about it. So that way when it's mentioned in an interview, you're not clueless. And then you should be familiar with basic system design concepts, such as how to make an application more scalable, meaning if there's a lot of users requesting a lot of data from a database, how can the database handle all those requests without being overloaded? And so this is where you can learn things about load balancing or caching, and then basic principles around designing a database and best practices involved in organizing the data in the database. And so you might be able to take a system design crash course such as Systems Expert, which I think it's a course on algoexpert.io. There's a lot of free online resources that teach this stuff too. It's just a matter of just being familiar with the basic concepts. So again, you don't sound clueless if they're mentioned in an interview, you have an idea. And then you should be able to effectively communicate your competence and experience and knowledge in an interview, because at the end of the day, the interview is just a way to guess if you're actually a software developer who can do the job. Part of the interview process is just you selling yourself as a competent software developer. And the only way you can communicate that is verbally. They might have you do specific coding challenges, and that's when you should excel in those specific coding challenges. But when it comes to like other things, like asking about your experience and your projects, you should be able to articulate your experience in a way that demonstrates you as a competent software developer that knows what he's doing. And a good tip for this when talking about experience is you want to be able to talk about your software development experience in detail and be able to get into the nitty-gritty. This will show that you actually have real experience doing it and you were actually involved in all the work that you mentioned on your resume, and it wasn't just like a high-level bullet point with no substance behind it. You want to make sure that you can go deep into the products that you built and the stuff that you have on your resume. And so you can practice this. This is something you can rehearse and prepare for. And so a really good way to do this is mock interviews. So there's websites like pramp.com. And so this is where you can actually practice articulating your thought process and verbally explaining the coding concepts that you're doing. And it takes practice. So you can't just code, because to get hired, you need to demonstrate and sell them on your ability to be a competent software developer as well. So that's why communication is important. And with my program, when students come in, I am, at least right now, at the time of releasing this video, I'll do unlimited mock interviews with my students until they land the job. And if that sounds interesting, again, you can book a call with me in the description to see if you're a good fit for the program. But doing these mock interviews are really going to greatly prepare you. And then you also want to have practice doing coding challenges in a defined time frame similar to an interview. So an interview often might be only like an hour long or so. And so you want to be able to be good at solving algorithms in that time frame, maybe building small, well-defined apps within that time frame, like a to-do app or a tic-tac-toe app. Interviews are only so long, and so they have to have you build like smaller things in that smaller time frame to see if you can actually build it. They can have you build a giant project in a couple of hours. To prepare for the interview and perform good in the interview, you should have practice building these small, well-defined apps. Now, I hope this doesn't overwhelm you. You don't need to learn everything I just mentioned in detail. I'm just saying have a basic idea of these concepts to maximize your probability. But what I would say is, as soon as you have your resume set up, you can start applying for interviews. You can interview, and then wherever you fail in the interview, just go back and focus on that and get good at the parts that you failed on the interview. And so this way, it's just an iterative feedback loop where you do the interviews, you might fail, you think, okay, where did I fail? What knowledge was I lacking? Go back, get that knowledge, study it, and then interview again. Wherever you fail, go back, get that knowledge. Just do that over and over until you pass one of the interviews. So that's what I recommend. I would not recommend just staying at home, trying to learn everything and prepare for the interview in every single dimension. It's a numbers game, interview, and wherever you fail, just focus on that. And that's the best thing you can focus on, because you're going to be focusing on the things that were actually asked in the interview. And so that's going to be much better than you trying to guess what they're going to ask. So this kind of comes back to knowing what's on the test. A lot of interviews are similar. So if you can prepare for the interview that one company gave you, then eventually you're going to be prepared to pass many different types of interviews. So you just need to get out there, do the work, get feedback. Based on that feedback, then you can go back and learn what you need to learn. And then as you do that, you're developing your skills, but not only that, you're also getting the numbers in to where eventually you're going to pass one of those interviews. One of the interviews might be just asking you questions that you happen to be more versed in, and so then you'll get in. And so now some tips for getting interviews I would recommend. You should have that resume that's stacked, makes you look super experienced, and then put that experience on LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn's a great platform that a lot of recruiters are on, and that's where you can find new opportunities. But if you can actually make yourself look like an experienced, competent software engineer with a strong track record, you're not going to have trouble getting interviews, because these software developers are in demand. Now, worst case scenario, if it starts taking you a long time to land an interview, you should know that you could at least build an online personal brand that sells yourself as a competent software engineer, and eventually you'll be able to start getting interviews. Now, that shouldn't be necessary if you actually do a good job at setting up your resume and your LinkedIn profile as an experienced, competent software developer. But I just wanted to throw that out there. That's a fail-proof strategy to eventually get into the industry, but that shouldn't be necessary. And especially if you join my program, I will help you with all that and setting up your resume and making it look experienced. Actually, students who join right now, I will be helping them with their resume personally. I'll be writing it myself and making it look as good as possible. They won't have to worry about that. And if you do want to join some kind of program that fast tracks you into the software development industry, here's my recommendation. I recommend you join a program that offers one-on-one coaching, because people have different needs, and sometimes they need their learning plan to be personalized based on their current situation. And sometimes they're stuck on concepts and they have specific questions, and to be able to get one-on-one help from someone, that person giving one-on-one coaching can help address their specific issues, oversee their path, and make sure that they're on the optimal path going into the industry. And whoever you get coached by, I recommend that it's by someone who has done what you want to achieve in the way that you want to achieve it. So if you want to become a software developer, obviously you should be coached by someone who's a software developer, but they should have become a software developer in the way that you want to become one. So if they got a computer science degree and that's how they became a software developer, but you don't want to go to college and you want to learn in 6-12 months or whatever, I'm sure they can help you, but it's probably not as good as learning from someone who actually did it in a shorter time frame than going to college, right? And then the biggest one I would say is when joining a program, you want to be with a program that sticks with you all the way till you land the job. So that way they're incentivized to actually help you land the job, and I just teach you basic coding and say that's enough, because ultimately the goal is to land a job and work as a software developer for you if you're watching this video. And if you're going to join like a coding bootcamp where it's just 3 or 6 months long and then you graduate, you might be left high and dry trying to land the job on your own. Where if you're in a program that sticks with you all the way to land the job, that's a much better deal. And so I offer those things. I do one-on-one coaching. I became a software engineer at Microsoft after 12 months teaching myself how to code, and I will stick with you all the way to land the job, helping you with everything, including learning how to code, full stack development, resume, projects. You can work for my software company, and then I'll stick with you to land the job and actually start getting paid as a software developer. And so the main thing with my program is that I make sure that you focus on what's most essential, getting rid of all the fluff. So every hour you spend studying, you're moving the needle as much as possible towards landing the job. And in this one-on-one program, you can text or schedule a call with me whenever you need. And ultimately, to get into the software development industry, you're either going to pay more with time or money. So if you try and implement everything in this video on your own, it's going to take you a certain amount of time. But if you were to join my program, you can instead pay money instead of your time to get there faster. So if you're someone who wants to invest in yourself financially so you can get there faster, then definitely look into my program. But if you're not someone who cares about fast tracking yourself into the software development industry as fast as humanly possible, then you can try and do everything in this video on your own, because you'd rather pay with time than money, because you don't mind spending more time. But if you don't want to spend more time, you want to do it as fast as possible, that's what the program's for. And as long as you're capable and able to invest in yourself financially, then there's that option for you. And I can tell you this program is much better than a typical big coding bootcamp. They often charge $15,000 to $30,000, and it's 3 to 6 months long, and then you're left high and dry trying to land the job on your own. And with them, you're just a number. With me, it'd be a relationship. You'd come into the program, I take you under my wing all the way till you land the job. So it'd be a mentorship program in that way, which I think is much more valuable than what a coding bootcamp would offer. Big coding bootcamps have a reputation. I don't have as big of a reputation. There's pros and cons. Just depends on what you want. Would you rather go with someone who has a bigger reputation, or would you rather go with me, who ultimately is offering more value, but you're going to have to trust me more? And so as long as you trust me and you believe that I can actually help you, then it's definitely a better option in my opinion. If you don't have any financial resources to invest in yourself, you can always still comment on this video, ask me what you need help with, and then I can still perhaps reply or it'll give me ideas to create more free content in the future to help you guys out. That's the end of the video, and I hope that was helpful, and best of luck.